How's it going, everybody? Greg here, Gregarious Media, here with a special edition video, sort of as a tag-along to my Discog Devil episode of Rustic Overtones, going over the worst and best of their discography. I wanted to go over this album, Viva Nueva, because there was a little bit of a history behind it that I feel like if I did in the episode of Discog Devil, it would have taken up at least 10, maybe even 12 minutes. So I want to go over Viva Nueva a little bit historically, and sort of explain afterward the versions of the albums that were released. So, Viva Nueva, Rustic Overtones were signed to Arista Records in 1999. Their album was produced by Tony Visconti, who is basically David Bowie's go-to guy for early and late career albums, and also featured artists like Funkmaster Flex on the song Smoke, Imogen Heap, I'm pretty sure I mispronounced her name, on Valentine's Day Massacre, and even David Bowie himself was featured on two songs, Sector Z on the chorus, and background vocals for Man Without a Mouth. Apparently, David Bowie did not even charge them for a feature because he really apparently liked Rustic Overtones that much. Like, that is fucking insane. For the history that I could find on this album, essentially, Rustic Overtones were signed supposedly for $1 million contract, and that's insane. In which, while I think Rustic Overtones definitely deserve that, I'm not sure where to confirm that claim. This album was recorded and was presented to the label. The management had shifted. I think Clive Davis was originally on Arista, and he left. He was kind of the guy who got Rustic on the label, and I think he left at that time. I think that's the history behind it. And whoever was in position managing the label now basically said, we want you to be Dave Matthews Band, in which I could slightly see Rustic doing a show with Dave Matthews during that time. They're a bit funkier, a bit more ska, a bit more aggressive than Dave Matthews, but they definitely have like the jam sort of sound, so I guess I could kind of see why maybe a label was like, oh, they could be the next Dave Matthews Band, but I feel like that's just doing an incredible disservice to Rustic's sound. But anyway, the album that was presented was much harder than the management wanted, so Rustic weren't going to compromise their sound, and they left. I think they were able to take some of the masters with them, but not all of them, or they just re-recorded a lot of these tracks when they moved on to Tommy Boy, in which then released the version of Viva Nueva that we know in 2001, which features their biggest songs, Come On and Combustible. And the track list was a little bit different, the mixing was a little bit more polished than the Arista version, and mind you, I haven't talked about the Arista version yet, but I'm going to get to that in a second. Unfortunately, after the album was released, a couple months later, Tommy Boy was bought out by Warner Brothers, and essentially, of course, when a label gets bought out, there are some artists that either get stay on the label or get kicked off, and Rustic were one of those that got kicked off. So after, this, two labels in the time span of like 3 years, basically having this massive legal clusterfuck, this actually caused Rustic to break up temporarily. They reunited in 2007 and have since been doing albums after Light at the End. In 2000 and I believe 14, I believe that was a year because I was there when they did the album in full, they released a remastered version of the Tommy Boy version of Viva Nueva, but the album also came with a second disc, which featured not only a couple bonus tracks, which I think were from those sessions, and also some live tracks from Portland back in like 1999, but they actually had the original master tracks of what was released on Arista Records. So the track listing is a little bit different. The mixing is a little bit different on some songs. But for the most part, a lot of the songs on here are actually the same as on Tommy Boy. So the 3 tracks that are different on this version are Carsick, Carnival, and Happy, whereas the Tommy Boy version, the different tracks on there were Come On, Love Underground, Combustible, Boys and Girls. I think that was it. Yeah, those are the only differences. So this album really has a lot of the same tracks as it does on the Tommy Boy release. So how does the Arista version, and this is kind of the reason I'm making this video, how does the Arista version sort of stack up to the Tommy Boy version? And say that this was the version that we ended up getting, not the Tommy Boy one, so we wouldn't have Come On or Combustible. Let's act like as if the Tommy Boy version does not exist in this timeline, that the Arista version is the one that we got. How does this album hold up? And I would say this is still a really good album, but I don't think it's as strong. And I'm not sure if this was how the album would have been originally organized in the track listing, but just going off of how it was organized in the re-release, I'm going to take it at face value that this was how the track list was organized. So you have the opener, Gas on Skin, with a slightly longer synth intro. You know how Gas on Skin came off of Come On with a little bit of like a kind of a eerie sort of synth, and the drums would kick right in. But the intro on here is a little bit longer, and otherwise after that it's the same structure, same song. It reaches about 3 minutes instead of being around 2.5. And I think it's a pretty decent intro track. I don't think it has nearly as much power, but I think it's a decent start to an album. Then you have the song Check, which is easily one of the strongest moments on the album. I think this version, compared to Rooms by the Hour, it definitely has much more of a punch to it, especially with more of the gang vocals in the background of the chorus. Crash Landing actually has a bit of a different mix. The keys are much more prominent, sounds a little bit higher in the mix, and a little bit less grand piano-esque. The drums sound a lot more electronic and almost sample-based. I would say this is not as good of a mix as the Tommy Boy mix, but say that this was the version that we got. It's not a bad song. It's good still, but it's definitely a weird transition from Check, I think. Sector Z with David Bowie. There's no crazed woman sample that your children shouldn't be listening to recordings known as rock and roll. It just sort of fades, but it fades into Smoke, which is actually a pretty great transition. Sector Z is still a great song. Smoke is still a great song. And of course, Valentine's Day Massacre right after that. So they're getting all the features out in this one block. And honestly, the way that they're structured is, I think, very, very great. The Hardest Way Possible, of course, this version I do really enjoy. Car Sick is not good. I like the version that I heard in Light at the End, so I know that it was a re-recording of this song. But the reason why I hate this version is because the synth effects, the synth lines, I don't think are as good. They're not as prominent. And the first verse, for whatever goddamn reason, has this terrible Vox box effect on Gutter's vocals, and it just sounds like trash. I'm just being perfectly honest. The rest of the song sounds pretty much the same. There's nothing significantly different. I think if the first verse didn't have that really weird-ass synth over the vocal Vox box kind of effect, this probably would have been a decent single. I would say it's still not, a strong track on here, but I could see it getting some play on an A&R standpoint. Revolution AM is good, still the same. And Carnival is on here with a slightly longer intro, Otherwise, the composition and songwriting is pretty much the same as what we got on the Light at the End version, so it's still not that strong of a song. I never really liked Carnival as a track, so I really wouldn't have gravitated toward this song as much. And then the rest of the album is pretty much the same mix. You have Hitman, you have The Beekeeper, and The Man Without a Mouth. But then you have Happy following that up. So Man Without a Mouth is not the closing track on here, but it's followed up, because Man Without a Mouth is one of the heaviest songs that Rustic has ever recorded. It's much more straightforward and super, super distorted guitars. But then it goes into the very mellow, almost jazzy Happy, which I think Happy as a closing track worked really well with Light at the End, and I think would have worked pretty well here, even if the transition from Man Without a Mouth, I think, seems a little bit haphazard. It's kind of like slapped on there. But Happy as a closing track, I think, would have worked really well. But instead, we still have Baby Blue on here, which is a track that I've never cared for, and it sounds like lounge elevator music. So that, as a closing track, seems like, what the fuck is this even doing here? Still. I mean, it's out of place on the Tommy Boy version, but on here, it's... Why is this a closing track? Why? I argue why it's even a track at all. But, I mean, it's on here, and it's the closer, so... I guess being after Happy, it makes more sense, because it follows from the mellowness of Happy. But Happy already sounds like it could have ended the album pretty well, again, even after its sort of awkward transition from Man Without a Mouth. But, you know, I digress. So that's 15 tracks, and that would have been the album that we would have gotten from Arista. So, from an A&R standpoint, what sort of songs would have been the most successful from this album in terms of, like, singles or radio airplay? Well, I would say Check is easily one of the strongest ones on here. It's easily one of the catchiest. The horns are extremely catchy. The gang vocals on the chorus is something that any Rustic live show would have had the crowd chanting along, and it's just super funky. It has a very nice groove, so Check would have easily been a strong single on here. Sector Z, I think you have to sort of promote the David Bowie feature one way or another, and I would say Sector Z, even though I love Man Without a Mouth, it's probably my favorite track off the album, I would say for a single, Sector Z would have made sense. It definitely has this weird funk rock sort of appeal to it, and it's not like super heavy. It has this very, very catchy work songwriting to it. I'm not describing things right. But no, Sector Z is a really, really catchy song. David Bowie kills the chorus, and instrumentally, it's really catchy. I wouldn't say quite poppy, but it's definitely not aggressive. It's not like super abrasive, sort of like the ska punk of the time. So I think this probably could have transitioned well into sort of like a more contemporary radio. Then you have Hardest Way Possible, and this version, I think it would have really done well. There's a reason why Rustic usually tend to play this version live, as opposed to the re-recorded Light at the End version, which, while I think that one is my favorite, it's only by a slight margin. I definitely prefer this version live, and it's just more energetic, and Dave's vocals are, I think, much more lively, even though maybe the tone for Light at the End version probably would have been better. But say this was the only recording that we got, I think this version would have worked really well. Other songs I think on here that would have done really well on like a radio standpoint probably would have been Smoke. Smoke is really aggressive and really funky. I think Man Without a Mouth and Happy probably would have had some chances. Man Without a Mouth would have easily been on some harder alternative stations, even arguably on a hard rock station, because of sort of the aggressive nature of the song. It's easily one of the heaviest songs they've written since the 20 Years off Long Division, or History Crush off Rooms by the Hour. And Happy, I think, would have been easily a great pop single. It's definitely a very mellow, relaxed, chill out tune that pretty much you could play at anything, whether it's like a gathering or a graduation, or it's like a very like group oriented kind of tune that I think anyone could go with. So would this album have succeeded? I would argue it probably would have gotten some traction with the right amount of promotion. I'll admit I don't know Arista Records' sort of track record when it comes to albums. I know that CeeLo Green was on there for a while for his first 2 solo albums, and I don't really know many other artists off that label at the time, but I think if Arista gave this album a chance and gave it the proper promotion, this probably could have gotten some buzz. I mean, of course you have the features on there, such as David Bowie and Funkmaster Flex, who are fucking huge in the 90s and even in 2000s. I mean, David Bowie still has a big fucking presence in music. He never really left. He had a couple missteps in the 90s and or like early 90s, and easily like his late 80s discography was a bit shoddy, but I mean, yeah, David Bowie is not a name that could really be fucked with. Like, if that's on your album, it's going to get traction from like magazines and press, like anything, and radio stations. And of course, Funkmaster Flex being in sort of the hip-hop field, that would have been a really cool sort of crossover thing for a lot of fans to go, whoa, Funkmaster Flex is on this song? Well, what the hell is he doing on a rock band's thing? That would sound great. And I don't know Imogen Heap as much, and I swear I'm mispronouncing her name, I'm sorry. But yeah, this her feature on Valentine's Day Massacre I think was really, really good. They probably would have had to cut down the song a little bit for a radio edit, since it is over 5 minutes on the album, but no, that could have been done. It's a really catchy, soulful kind of tune. But yeah, I think this album could have sold pretty well. I don't think it would have been like the big explosion that Rustic Overtones would have been looking for. I think the Tommy Boy version actually does have a lot better songs and maybe structure of the album as opposed to this. Because again, you have songs like Car Sick, which I think, you know, if they got rid of that fucking vocal effect in the first verse and had stronger synth recordings, I think the song would have been a pretty go-to radio single. Again, it's not my favorite Rustic Overtones song, but I like it. I like the version that was re-recorded on Light at the End. But the Arista version is garbage to me. Only because of the first verse. And I don't know, I think that's just enough. And Carnival, I just don't think really has any impact. I mean, it has like the little bit of carny sounds in the background to sort of fit the theme, but overall it's not that interesting of a song. But other than that, you have this very signature funk, rock, ska fusion that really I think would have stood out in the early 2000s. I mean, I argued in my Discog Devil episode that their early albums, if they were released on a major label, those would have stood the test of time as major releases. I truly feel like Rustic Overtones had a sound that, even though it was clearly in sort of the funk rock and sort of ska explosion of the mid-90s and early 2000s sort of timeline, that if Rustic had the promotion, they would have been just as big, if not one of the biggest names, I truly believe, in alternative rock music, even to this day. That rambling aside, if this was the album that was released, say that this was the version that we got, and then we go to Light at the End, we don't have the Tommy Boy version, although I guess Light at the End would be a little weird since they have re-recordings of other songs from this album. So say we ignore Light at the End, and it goes just straight into New Way Out and all that. I think that would be I think that Rustic would still hold up pretty well, even if sort of in today's age rock music isn't quite as mainstream. I still think Rustic would have a pretty solid following. But this album would probably rank a little bit lower, this version. Some songs, like, Carsick, Carnival, Baby Blue, I think hinder the album. The mixing on Crash Landing is not as strong. Still a solid album. I think none of these songs, I think, match up to the power that, Combustible had. Combustible was clearly a signature track, is a signature track in Rustic to this day. And, if the Tommy Boy version had much more promotion, I think it would have been even bigger. But, no song on here, I think, matches up to sort of the catchiness that is Combustible, or even Come On. I think Come On had more. I'd say Check would have probably been up there. Maybe even, the ones I listed earlier, Check, Sector Z, and Hardest Way Possible, probably would have had the same. I'd put them up there as the catchier moments of either version of the album, but I would still probably edge Come On over those songs. And even Boys and Girls and Love Underground, I think those ones are really underrated cuts. I just think that the Tommy Boy version had the stronger mixes, and I think the stronger songwriting, and I think better tracklist structure. The tracklist structure on here isn't bad, but it does kind of hop a little bit more than the Tommy Boy version, much more noticeably. And again, I think there are just some weaker songs on here that I'm kind of glad were re-recorded or re-released on Light at the End, because I think if this was the album that was released from Arista as the official version, I think it would have been a good album, but I don't think it would be nearly as great, sort of in hindsight. I wouldn't rank this higher than Rooms by the Hour, and I'm not even sure I would rank it higher than New Way Out. But overall, the Arista version, I think, is still a good album, and I think that if Arista did properly promote this album, then I think Rustic would have had a pretty good, at least couple years of following with this album. I don't know what they would have followed it up with. That's obviously an alternative timeline that, it's like a what if situation. But I think this album would have done Rustic a pretty good promotion. It would have gotten them a lot more fans on alternative rock stations and even a couple hard rock stations. And there's even a couple songs that I would say would almost cross over into Billboard, like Hot 100, maybe even Top 40. I'm not sure if any of these would have went up to number 1 on Billboard, but I'm pretty sure that they would have had at least a few good solid hits sort of within that timeline, since ska and alternative rock were still really, really huge during that time period. So that's kind of what I wanted to go over with this video, was the two different versions of Viva Nueva, and more specifically the Arista version, and sort of how it compared to the original. If you want to go check out my Discog Devil episode that is actually revolved around this album and this band, click the box there at the end of this video, and also check out the playlist, which will be in the description below. And yeah, I think that will do it. So thank you guys for listening. I would have had video for this, but I do not. My camera decided to die, so you're just getting pictures and video. And hopefully I've edited this down, because god fucking damn, I've talked for over almost 26 minutes at this point. So yeah, thanks for watching. And like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube shtick. Social medias in description. And I'll also provide a Spotify playlist for Rustic Overtones as well for you guys to check out. which is also in the Discog Devil episode as well. Anyway, I've been rambling, so yeah, thank you. Goodbye. Woo!